Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some tasks feel super easy and others feel like climbing a mountain? Could it be that our brains have natural ways of doing things, and when we ask them to do something that goes against that natural flow, it takes extra effort? This new study dives into that idea using something called linear control theory. They looked at how much mental effort is needed for different tasks, especially when our brains have to do something that doesn't come naturally. Think about the Stroop Test. When you see the word red written in blue ink and you have to say the color of the ink, not the word. That is tricky, right? Why? Because your brain's natural tendency is to read the word. This research proposes that cognitive effort, the feeling of mental exertion, is basically the energy it takes for our brain's control system to make our minds do things that are a bit outside its usual comfortable pathways. They used a mathematical tool called linear control theory, which engineers use to control complex systems. To study this, let's break down this crazy idea. Imagine your brain is like a super complex machine with lots of interconnected parts. These parts have a natural way they like to work together based on how they are wired. When you ask your brain to do something it's already good at, like reading a sentence, it's easy and doesn't take much energy. But when you ask it to do something different, like ignoring the words and only focusing on the color of the ink in the Stroop task, it has to work harder to push against its natural tendencies. That extra push is what we feel as cognitive effort. The researchers wanted to test this with a classic brain model. They picked a well-known artificial neural network model of the Stroop task developed by Cohen and his colleagues back in 1990. This model is like a computer simulation of how our brain might handle tasks like the Stroop. Essentially, they treated the neural network as a dynamical system. Think of a dynamical system as something that changes over time, like a swinging pendulum or a flowing river. They used math to describe how the different parts of this model, called units, change their activity over time. The core idea is represented by this equation that shows how the state of the system changes based on its internal connections and external inputs. Here, X is like the overall activity level of the brain model at any given moment, and A is a matrix that describes how the internal parts of the model influence each other. B is another matrix that describes how external inputs, like what you see on the screen, affect the model, and U is the control input, like the instruction you get to perform a task. They took the actual connection strengths from this 1990 model and plugged them into their linear control theory framework. In their setup, the model had input units for color, for the word itself, and crucially, for the task demand like color naming versus word reading. The model also had hidden units that process information and output units that represent the final decision or response. They found that the natural dynamics of the system, when there was no control input for task demand, showed some interesting behaviors. For example, even without specific instructions, the model could sometimes perform the task, but it wasn't perfectly efficient. When they turned off the task demand control, the model often made errors on the incompatible trials, meaning it would read the word instead of naming the color. The reaction times, how long it took to respond, were also slower for these tricky incompatible trials. But here is where it gets really interesting. They analyzed how controllable the system was. Think of controllability as how easily you can steer the system to a specific desired state. They found that this particular model was not fully controllable. This means there are certain directions or states within the model that are very hard to reach or influence just by using the control input. They calculated something called the controllability gradient. This is a fancy math tool that tells them which directions in the system's state space are easy to control and which are hard. The important finding was that there was only one direction that was relatively easy to control. All other directions were essentially impossible to influence. This meant that while the brain model could easily manage some aspects of the task, it struggled with others, especially those that went against its natural wiring. So how much energy does it take to steer the system to the desired outcome? They used the method called linear quadratic regulation, or LQR. This is like finding the most efficient way to use the control input to reach a target state while minimizing the effort. Essentially, this forms a feedback loop. The control unit continuously adjusts its output based on how far the system is from the desired state. When they applied this feedback control, the model performed much better. It could successfully navigate the tricky incompatible trials, like the red word in blue ink, and produce the correct color response. The reaction times on these difficult trials also improved, though they were still a bit slower than the easy compatible trials. This control process also came with an energy cost. They measured the energy required. As expected, the incompatible trials, the ones that go against the brain's natural tendencies, required significantly more energy to complete correctly compared to the compatible trials. This directly links the mathematical concept of control energy to the subjective feeling of cognitive effort. What does this all mean? The researchers are suggesting that cognitive effort isn't just some vague feeling. It is a quantifiable consequence of our brain's internal architecture. When we need to perform tasks that deviate from the brain's intrinsic manifold, it's natural. Effortless way of operating, we have to expend extra energy. This extra energy is what we perceive as cognitive effort. This study provides a mathematical framework to understand why some tasks are harder than others. It highlights that our brains are wired for efficiency, and when we push them beyond that natural wiring, it costs energy. This could explain why we feel drained after intense mental work or why we tend to procrastinate on difficult tasks. Our brains are trying to conserve energy by sticking to what feels natural. Now, we should remember that this is a simplified model. Real brains are way more complex than this artificial neural network. The study used linear control theory, but real brain dynamics are often nonlinear. Also, the controllability of the real brain might be different. However, this research offers a powerful new lens through which to view cognitive effort. It moves beyond just saying it feels hard and provides a mechanism. The idea of a controlosphere, the space of difficult, high-effort states, is a fascinating concept. It suggests that our ability to perform complex tasks relies on our brains actively engaging control mechanisms to navigate these less efficient states. So next time you are struggling with a mental task, remember that your brain might be working overtime to push against its natural inclinations. It's a reminder of how our brains are optimized for efficiency, and that sometimes doing the hard thing really does take energy. It's not just you being lazy, it's your brain's control system working hard. This is a really cool example of how we can use engineering principles to understand psychological phenomena. What do you think about this idea? Does it make sense with your own experiences? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science unpacked. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.